All right. Everyone can see my screen. All right. The Virgin Mary is a symbol of purity, chastity, and motherhood for the followers of Christianity. Her role as the Virgin Mother of Jesus Christ is held with high esteem and has led to her prominent place among Christian imagery, especially that of the Italian Renaissance. Paintings were commissioned for church altarpieces, private homes, monasteries, and chapels. In Tuscany, the region of Italy in which the well-known cities of Siena and Florence reside, paintings of the Annunciation were all but sparse. While each artist had their own style, depictions generally held true to tradition. However, Tuscan Annunciation painting shifted throughout the Italian Renaissance from having a focus on important narrative conventions to being depicted with special attention towards the relationship and tension between Mary and Gabriel. While traditional narrative elements remained, artists' main concern became the relationship between the two figures to tell the story. This study will suggest that over the course of 200 years, between roughly 1333 and 1528, the subject of the Annunciation shifted in its focus through changes in setting, the use of narrative elements, and the use of line and color. Now, what is the Annunciation exactly? It is a biblical reference from Luke 1:26 through 38 to the moment when the Archangel Gabriel arrived on earth to inform the Virgin Mary that she would give birth to the Son of God. The subject is closely intertwined with the idea of the incarnation, which occurred when the Holy Spirit descended upon the Virgin and she miraculously conceived the Son of God while her virginity remained eternally unbroken. The incarnation is important to address because it is a single moment included within the full scope of the Annunciation narrative. The first visual representations of the Annunciation were found in the Roman catacombs of Priscilla from the early 4th century, according to Gertrude Schiller. The representation contains the basic iconography of the subject, in which includes two figures, Mary and Gabriel, composed in an undefined space. As time went on, Annunciation paintings became frequently placed as the central panel of an altarpiece, in which they recognized the Annunciation as a historical event, but also as happening presently in Mass. They act as a tool to urge church members to contemplate the story and witness the miracle in front of them. Regarding visual conventions of the subject, the Virgin Mary is usually seen seated on the right of the composition, while Gabriel is seen either kneeling or bowing on the left. Mary wears a blue robe with a red or pink gown, and the color of Gabriel's clothing varies by artist, but he is most often depicted wearing red, pink, gold, green, or a combination of the colors. Mary is often portrayed reading or with a book in her hands, which reference the prayer and meditation of Mary that unknowingly prepared her for the coming of God. There's often an olive branch that represents peace, and white lilies tend to have a prominent place as they represent beauty, purity, and grace, as well as being the symbol of virginal motherhood for Mary. A dove can often be found in the compositions, usually being released from a pair of hands from the upper zone of the image. The hands belong to God, and they emit a steady stream of light rays headed towards the Virgin Mary. The dove represents the Holy Spirit and is most often aimed at the Virgin's ear, which emphasizes her impregnation by God's word, according to Gary Waller. These are the most common elements found in Italian Renaissance Annunciation painting and are used in various combinations by most artists of the time. I will now transition into a brief visual analysis of 5 of my key images. Simone Martini's Annunciation with Two Saints was painted in approximately 1333 with tempera on wood and a gilded gold background. This work is the first preserved altarpiece dedicated to the subject of the Annunciation and was commissioned by the Siena Cathedral. We see Gabriel kneeling in profile on the left, holding an olive branch. Mary sits on a throne on the right of the composition in her typical clothing with a book in her hand. A vase of lilies sits between the figures, and directly above is a dove encircled by 8 angels. Subtle golden rays extend from the beak of the dove to the ear of Mary, referencing the incarnation. There is a raised Latin inscription originating from Gabriel's mouth and extending to Mary's ear that translates to "Hail to the Lord, full of grace," a direct quote from the book of Luke. This painting lacks a specific setting and rather is placed in eternity, suggested by the gold leaf background that accentuates an emphasis on two-dimensionality. It is important to note that Martini's work is the only Sienese painting that will be discussed. Due to this, stylistically, it is a bit different from Florentine paintings with the same subject. However, the work is crucial to this study because Siena's patron saint was the Virgin Mary herself. The next painting is the Annunciation of Santisima Annunziata, painted in the early 14th century by an unidentified artist. It is painted in fresco and located at the Santisima Annunziata in Florence, which is named after this miraculous painting. Legend has it that the artist fell asleep while painting the scene, and when he awoke, an angel's hand had finished the details. During the period, this painting gained a lot of traction among religious followers, and the church became a site of pilgrimage. The painting became so significant that smaller reproductions began to be created throughout the city. This replication signifies how important accessibility to this image was, and that not just the physical painting was valuable. Gabriel bows on the left and Mary sits on the right, with a book propped open on the bench in front of her. The figures are placed in a box-like interior with little architectural definition outside of an embellished bench. A set of golden rays emanate diagonally down towards Mary's upturned face, and the Holy Ghost, in the form of a dove, flies towards her through the rays. Latin text is written backwards, running parallel to the golden rays originating from Mary's mouth. It translates to, "Behold the handmaid of the Lord," a direct reference to the story in Luke. The next painting, Filippo Lippi's Annunciation, was painted between 1450 to 53 using Temperon wood. It was commissioned by the Medici, Florence's ruling family, for their palace, the Palazzo Medici. This means the painting was for a private domestic space, which changes how the subject was portrayed. Lippi's composition is split into two halves by a short parapet and a vase of lilies to create Gabriel's garden space and an intimate bedroom space for Mary. At the top of the panel, in between the two figures, is a dark cloud with the single hand of God extending out in a blessing gesture. Subtle sparkles arranged in spirals descend down towards Mary's stomach. A dove flies right beside the book, resting in Mary's lap. The next painting is Leonardo da Vinci's Annunciation from 1472, using oil and Temperon wood. According to the Uffizi Gallery, little is certain about the original location or patron of the painting, but it may have been painted for the Church of San Bartolomeo a Monte Oliveto in Florence. Gabriel is once again seen on the left and Mary on the right. Gabriel holds a lily branch in his left hand. Mary wears her typical red gown and blue robe, and a decorative lectern sits in front of Mary as she holds a book open with her right hand. The interaction is set in an enclosed garden space, and in the distance, separated from Mary and Gabriel by a parapet with a small opening, there is a series of large trees varying in shape and size. A break in the trees reveals a beautiful receding Tuscan landscape full of mountains, even including a seaport full of towers and ships. Da Vinci's Annunciation would have been very innovative for its time, as he paints the momentary action suggested by Gabriel just landing and the flowers blowing away beneath him. He also introduces a vast landscape and world beyond the story happening in front of us. Lastly is Jacopo Pontormo's Annunciation from 1527 to 28 in fresco. The painting spans the entirety of a wall in the Camponi Chapel in Santa Felicita in Florence. The painting remains in situ, or in its original location today. Gabriel and Mary are separated by a stained glass window and altar not original to the chapel. Before this reliquary was built, the figures were separated by a vase of lilies centered between them, according to Jack Wasserman. The background is simple, and we see Gabriel on the left and Mary on the right. Gabriel's billowing gown and spread wings suggest that he may have just arrived. Mary is seen standing rather than sitting, and she is walking up a set of stairs, but pauses to turn her upper body out towards the viewer and look at Gabriel behind her as if he has just interrupted her action. Her left foot still lingers on the bottom stair and her right hand on the railing. She looks directly at Gabriel with a subtle look of surprise on her face. This work closely resembles Andrea del Sarto's Annunciation from the same year, in that many common narrative elements have been stripped away to focus on the tension between the two figures. Overall, the imagery of Tuscan Annunciation paintings from the Italian Renaissance remained traditional, but shifted in their main focus, which became the relationship between Mary and Gabriel. In terms of setting, artists moved from placing the subject on gold backgrounds, as seen with Martini, to more architecturally rich spaces defined by porticos or porches and bedrooms that gave the images a sense of space and relatability. Relatability is especially emphasized in the work of Lippi, which was created for a domestic space and is characterized by Renaissance architectural themes that accentuate the location of the work. It is also emphasized in Da Vinci's work, in which he includes a vast Tuscan landscape. This relatability may have helped to emphasize the relationship between Mary and Gabriel by suggesting to the viewer that the Annunciation happened in a space that was familiar to them. By doing this, the viewer felt a sense of connection to the imagery, thus leading to a deeper understanding of the encounter between the two figures. The encounter feels more humanized and realistic, which in turn offers the viewer the opportunity to understand the tension and relationship portrayed. Generally, narrative elements stayed the same throughout the period, with artists having the choice of which components to include in their own work. Most artists chose to include Mary's book, the lilies, and the dove. However, artists became less focused on including these elements. This is suggested by the minimal amount of narrative conventions used by later artists such as Da Vinci, Pontormo, or Sarto, who have a special focus on Mary and Gabriel themselves. This is evident in how each of those artists place Mary and Gabriel in relation to each other, and how the reaction of one figure is based upon the reaction of the other. A specific example of this is how Pontormo's Mary pauses on the stairs and turns back to look at Gabriel because she sees him appear. Other changes, such as the color palettes used, were also observed. Annunciation shifted from using more muted colors and lots of gold leaf to being characterized by rich jewel and earth tone based palettes, defined with chiaroscuro, or the use of shadow, that allowed for modeling and an emphasis on drapery in the figures. This is especially evident in the paintings of Sarto and Pontormo, in which bright colors were reserved for the clothing of the figures themselves to catch the viewer's attention and focus on the relationship between them. This is suggested by how in Pontormo's work, the viewer's eye is immediately caught by Gabriel's bright billowing cape. If one follows the line of sight, Gabriel's cape leads us to his face, where his eyes are directed towards Mary. Mary's hood leads the eye down into the drapery of her red gown and back up again to her eyes, where the tension lingers between the eye contact of the two figures. The use of line and color help to draw the viewer to this tension and focus on the relationship in which the story is told. Line is used similarly in Leonardo da Vinci's work, in which the eye is first caught by the green and red drapery of Gabriel. The folds within his drapery lead us down his arm, where we find his hand in a blessing gesture. Gabriel's two raised fingers lead us to the right hand of Mary that props her Bible open. The line of Mary's arm leads us through to her raised left hand, where her fingers guide the viewers up to her eyes. There, the viewer's gaze is directed towards Gabriel's eyes, where the tension of the encounter is held between their intense eye contact. While the line of sight can be observed in earlier works like Martini's, it does not leave the viewers pondering the relationship between Mary and Gabriel. For example, in the Santisima Annunziata work, line is used to emphasize the relationship between Mary and the Holy Spirit, as the line of sight leaves the viewer's eye lingering around the golden rays and the words that Mary speaks. In conclusion, while every artist of the Annunciation, of the Italian Renaissance tasked with painting the Annunciation did so in their own style, it is evident that most stayed within the realm of traditional representation. However, even as paintings of the subject stuck with tradition in terms of narrative conventions and basic composition, the main focus of the painting itself shifted. Tuscan artists towards the latter part of the Italian Renaissance became less concerned about placing emphasis on various narrative elements, although some elements were still included, and instead focused on showcasing the relationship between Mary and Gabriel and how the two interact with one another. Through deep visual analysis, this shift can be observed through changes in setting to more relatable spaces, a lesser use of narrative conventions, and the use of line and color to draw the viewer's eye towards the body language of the two figures to emphasize the tension between them. The shift is important to acknowledge because it brings the viewer to a deeper understanding of the interaction between Mary and Gabriel and allows the viewer to envision the scene unfolding before them. Artists of the Italian Renaissance have offered viewers the opportunity to step into the biblical world and experience it for themselves. Thank you for listening, and thank you to our wonderful moderator.
Thank you, Madison. So we will be taking questions at the end of the presentations. So next, we have Sarah Hanlon, who will be presenting Voices in History, Program Planning, and Arts Organizations.
Hello, everyone. Okay. Can everyone see this? Awesome. Okay, so I am presenting Voices in History, Program Planning and Arts Organizations. So first things first, what is program planning? Program planning is integral to the success of an arts organization, and it's a huge opportunity to bring in a new audience base, expand your core audience, showcase the work your organization has been doing, and more. It's also another way to solidify your organization's values in the community and its core mission. When planning a program, it's important to consider the overall mission and vision of your organization. And another thing to think about is what your community needs at the time. Finding inspiration for programs can be difficult, but it's always a good idea to base it off of current events or something that ties into your organization's overarching message. Also, it's important to remember that organizations plan years in advance while doing strategic planning, so allowing some room for change is also helpful. So as an arts administration student at UNCG, I was asked to plan a program for the Harvey B. Gantt Center featuring an international artist that aligns with their mission statement. And I decided I wanted to focus on music and create a program that brought awareness to the enormous impact of African-American artists on the music industry and country as a whole. In alignment with their mission of inspiring conversation, this program showcases the talents of African Americans and shares their experiences while also inspiring conversation on the subject of the impact Black musicians have had on the music industry. As a center whose goal is to uplift and amplify Black voices, this program is the perfect opportunity to do that. By highlighting the impact of African American music on the country throughout history, the Gantt Center is sparking conversation about the origins of many different genres and appreciating the work and passion that previous artists in the Black community did not get thanks for due to the racism and prejudice that was and still is prevalent in this country's society. So onto the Harvey B. Gantt Center. So this picture right here, this is Harvey B. Gantt himself. So the Harvey B. Gantt Center for African American Arts and Culture is an organization with the main goal of presenting, preserving, and celebrating excellence in the art, history, and culture of African Americans and people of African descent. Another part of their mission is to ignite engagement and conversations that inspire, empower, and enlighten all. They host a multitude of programs and events to further this goal, such as this one. So this program will be held in June, which was declared by President Barack Obama to be African American Music Appreciation Month, which was previously known as Black Music Month, created by President Jimmy Carter. There will be 2 events every week with various musicians showcasing the different music styles throughout history. The first week will cover genres from the 1920s to the 1960s. The second week will focus on the 70s to the 2000s. And the third week will cover the 2010s to 2020. The fourth and final week of events starring an international artist will focus on the most current music and how its style has been affected by the current political climate. After every performance, there will be a short lecture explaining the historical context of the music that was just heard and its importance in that time. The Gantt Center will work with a representative from the North Carolina Museum of History to ensure all information is accurate and relates to the music being performed. These events will be hosted every Friday and Saturday evening, coming out to a total of 8 performances that month, including the events hosted by our international artists. Each performance will take place in the Performance Center of the Harvey B. Gantt Center and is open to all North Carolina residents. So this program is needed to further the Gantt's mission of celebrating excellence in the art, history, and culture of African Americans and people of African descent. Recently, Black pain and suffering has been displayed all over the media and throughout our society. And we wanted to remind the community that though we may be far from where we need to be in regards to the political climate and equality that's deserved, African Americans have always risen above and come out stronger. This program's entire purpose is to celebrate Black excellence. While the social context of the era the music was created and performed is explained in the lectures after the performances, the performers and their music are at the forefront of the program. This program is also needed to increase the Gantt Center's music programming. They've mostly focused on art, dance, cinema, and poetry, but not as much on music in the past. This will change that and hopefully bring in even more of an audience that they may not have had exposure to before. Most of their programs and events require tickets as well, so having this program for free will also attract more members of the community and make this program more accessible. Due to the accessibility and educational nature of the program, I believe it will not only bring more awareness to the history of African American music and its impacts, it will also bring the community closer together by creating a safe space to appreciate Black art in a world that still isn't appreciative of Black creativity and expression. So onto the philosophy and criteria. So this program is in alignment with the mission of the Gantt Center in that it showcases the talents of African Americans and shares their experiences while also inspiring conversation on the subject of the impact African Americans have had on the music industry in the country. As a center whose goal is to uplift and amplify Black voices, this program is the perfect opportunity to do that by highlighting the impact of their music on the country. They are sparking conversation about many different genres. This program also allows our audiences to enjoy and learn the meaning behind different eras and genres of music and demonstrate how social movements coincide with Black music. It also draws attention to the theft of Black creativity, which will bring more awareness to the hidden figures in music whose impacts were immeasurable. So some criteria, similar to having the artist chosen by a jury, the entire program will be created based on a set of criteria created by a panel of diverse and experienced employees, volunteers, artists, and the representative from the North Carolina Museum of History. This ensures that all events are historically accurate and portray Black artists correctly without perpetuating stereotypes made against them in the past and present social climate. These panel members will be recruited by the Gantt Center's Director of Programming and Administrative staff. And not only will this panel create the standards for which Voices in History will abide by, they will also review all performances and lectures before they are held to check for quality and integrity, as well as ensuring that everything aligns with the Gantt Center's overall mission of preserving and celebrating excellence in the art, history, and culture of African Americans and people of African descent. So how is success defined for the program? For arts organizations such as the Harvey B. Gantt Center, programs similar to Voices in History always have specific goals and desired outcomes in mind. For this program, success can be defined by presenting the talents of local Black artists and the creations of African American music legends, thus preserving and celebrating African American culture. These events will also bring together the community through music and knowledge. There are specific outcomes that I've set out as goals for the program, as well as being indicators of the success of the events in educating and connecting our community. So there are four main goals for this program to determine success. The first is that Voices in History will bring more exposure to underrepresented Black artists in the community, giving them a platform to share their talents and grow their fan bases. The second goal is that the audience truly learns something about Black musicians throughout history and their impact on society. The third goal is that this program will bring in more interest for historical-based programs and events, allowing the Gantt Center to expand their educational programming. And finally, if this program is successful, a large goal is that international collaborations such as this one will be much more common for the Harvey B. Gantt Center. So the main ideas and plans for this program will be collaborated on with several people. First and foremost, the international artists will be asked for their input to ensure they're happy with the program they are presenting and being a part of. The Gantt Center is also planning on working with their other local musicians to bounce ideas around on how they want the events to work and consider what is best for each individual artist. I greatly value the artists and musicians' contributions to planning these events because without them, the program wouldn't really exist. It's also imperative that they are pleased with what we require of them and their responsibilities so they can give the best performance to the audience. We also want to get our community's input on what this program should look like. So we will send out surveys and host a small town hall to ask for their thoughts and opinions on how this program can cater best towards them. And another collaborator we seek guidance from is the production and administration staff of the Gantt Center, since they are so integral to the operations of the organization. As well as the staff, we will also seek advice and input from our representative from the North Carolina Museum of History to help create the lectures and informational sessions. We'll create the bulk of plans with them after we gain input from both our artists and the community to create something that works best for everyone. And conclusively, plans made by the administration and production staff will be looked over and changed as needed by the Gantt Center's program coordinator. The plans, including financial planning in terms of the yearly budget and mission plan, will then be sent to the board of directors for approval. Due to their business structure as a nonprofit organization and based on the program we are planning, the administrative and production staff will have the most influence over planning, while the director is more focused on the decision-making aspect of the program. So onto program evaluation. This is always super helpful for planning future programs and events because it gives us insight into what our audience needs from us and if we did a good job fulfilling that need with our current program. So Voices in History was created to serve all North Carolina residents who want to learn more about the impact of African Americans on the music industry and country, as well as for the African American population in the area to showcase the Black icons who have changed history with their music. The goal of the Harvey B. Gantt Center is to attract their current audience, as well as expand a bit to a newer audience who may not have been exposed to the organization before. Their main focus is on the core audience, which is majority African American and close by in the community. This program is serving those who have historically been underrepresented and focusing solely on them and their impact on music and the country. The Gantt Center is also aiming to draw in a new audience of music lovers, though, by bringing in local musicians and having their audiences follow them to the programming. Since the program is free and open to all North Carolina residents, it's extremely accessible. And for this program to be successful, I'm really relying on the Gantt Center's main audience, the people who consistently come to performances and seminars to attend these events. So a very important aspect of programs like this one is the feedback an arts organization receives from their audience on their events. This is so they can either continue planning things in a similar way or shift their focus to cater more to the audience members and their preferences. Measuring the outcomes of arts organizations are vital to the planning processes of future events. The Harvey B. Gantt Center has several ways of measuring these outcomes. To measure the outcome relating to the Gantt Center's international artists and their relationship with them, they will invite them back for an exit interview to gain insight on their experiences and if they would be willing to work alongside the Harvey B. Gantt Center again. To measure their ability to collaborate with more international artists, this will be a more long-term measurement where the Gantt Center will measure the amount of international artists who are willing or who will collaborate with them in future programs. Focusing more on audience outcomes, there will be a survey sent out to every participant after each lecture with various questions, testing them on what they learned and if they knew what, like the information beforehand that was taught in those lectures. Ticket sales will also be measured for every event to determine if they increase as the program progresses, showing increased interest in educational programming at the Harvey B. Gantt Center. And yeah, so thank you for your time. I really appreciate you coming today. And if you have any questions, please let me know.
Okay, wonderful. I'm going to pin our two panelists here so we can see both of them. There we are. And I would like to invite questions from the audience. I also have some questions prepared. It looks like Dr. Scalisi is in the chat. So I'm going to head and read this question. So she says, Madison, I arrived a few minutes late, so perhaps I'm misunderstanding, but are you thinking that these Annunciation scenes by Italian artists function as portals to that biblical moment, i.e. a shift in temporality from our present to the moment Annunciation as constantly unfolding?
Not quite, Dr. Scalisi, but that is a wonderful interpretation of it. No, my thesis, I'll just restate my thesis really quickly for you, is that the paintings themselves shifted throughout the period of the Italian Renaissance from having a focus on important narrative conventions, where like that was the main focus. Artists were very concerned about making sure that they had a vase of lilies and they had a dove representing these certain parts of the story, shifting to where those narrative conventions were still important, but the artists became less concerned about them because they were focused on explaining and emphasizing the human encounter between Mary and Gabriel. And I didn't get the chance to mention this in my presentation, but during the period of the Italian Renaissance, about midway through, there was the rise of humanism, which was the rebirth of classical antiquity, which played a huge role in this shift because artists became so focused on this rise of humanism and relating to the human encounter. And so that became to be reflected in the work that was being created.
Sorry, I just wanted to read into the recording. Dr. Scalisi says, fascinating. That's helpful clarity. Thank you. Careful tracing of iconographies and close looking Madison. Thanks. Bummed she missed the first few moments. Who else has a question for our panelists?
I have a piggyback question to Dr. Scalisi's question.
Thanks, Dr. Steen.
Madison, when you're looking at that, and I'm glad you brought up the rise of humanism, because that had been part of my initial part of the question. But is there any argument to be made for seeing this shift to the human interaction more so in annunciation imagery versus other biblical narrative imagery that we see, or do we see it equally across? And I realize that's a question that stretches beyond the scope of what you presented, but I assume you were looking at other things as you thought about this.
That's a great question. I was mainly focused on looking at annunciations. I have 6 key images. I only got to talk about 5 of them, but in my paper, I talk about like 12 different annunciation paintings. And I did do a little bit of research coming across subjects of the Virgin and the Child and Madonna paintings. And I would say that the shift can be seen in other biblical narratives. I just don't know how drastically that shift was made, since I didn't focus my research on that whole scope. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Scalisi also has a question for Sarah. Sarah, I wonder if you see this model as usable outside of the Gantt.
Yeah, so that's a really cool question. I kind of approached this project with that in mind, just because I don't know where I'm going to end up when it comes to arts organizations or nonprofits, and planning programs that are, I went to the situation where I kind of made the gears and put them all together and made sure they were well oiled, and then put in the details of the artists and the scheduling and talking with the representative from North Carolina Museum of History. So I really do think this can be applied in other situations as well for other organizations. Just they might have to shift a few details, such as the actual bulk of programming, like the main idea, to kind of align with their mission and vision. But otherwise, the actual planning part and strategic planning part of this program, I think, could be easily applied to other organizations. Thank you.
I'd like to invite any additional questions. So yes, for Madison, my question was about whether the choices to emphasize line and composition and not the narrative elements was reflective of changes in religious practice or church history, and you have answered that already. So Sarah, I wanted to ask if you wanted to briefly reflect for us on how COVID-19 might impact this kind of programming for cultural organizations, because I'm sure you've given lots of thought to that.
Yes. So I was given the option. I talked to my advisor and my professor about it, and she was like, just run with it. Pretend COVID doesn't exist. So I did that for this project, it was so nice to live in that fantasy world for a little bit. But I have been thinking about that a lot for these types of arts organizations that thrive off of in-person engagement. So a lot of organizations have already been kind of tackling this COVID problem in many different ways, such as there's a performance center in Nashville, Tennessee, the Grand Ole Opry. They are doing live streams of performances. Some people pay a subscription fee to see weekly live streams of performances that usually they would go to in person. They're also having limited capacity performances. I'm not sure about now, but just when I was researching it a few months back, but they would have limited capacity performances. So of course the prices of the tickets would be raised a little bit. So accessibility on that point was not really the best. For this program in particular, I would go along with the live streaming. And at this point in COVID, with the restrictions kind of easing up, I'd still like require vaccination status, masking, because also the Gantt Center has an enormous performance space that allows for social distancing. So it might have to be limited capacity, but there wouldn't be any prices on the tickets for that. It would just be first come, first serve. But also the performances would still be live streamed for those who don't feel comfortable coming in person. And also the videos will be posted on their website and social media. And also just so that since most people wouldn't be able to be there in person, to kind of add a little bit more incentive to watch, I would have people like staff and the artists do like Q&As on their Instagram, like day in the life, kind of showing like the process of setting up, just to keep the interest up and also provide the audience with something they wouldn't have had in the first place. It's just since COVID has kind of taken away a lot, and I feel like that might be a nice way for them to interact with their fan bases.
Madison, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the types of architecture and interior spaces in the figures that you showed us, and how they were meant to like invoke a sense of spirituality or reverence for the churchgoers who would see these.
Absolutely. I wish I had my images in front of me. A lot of the imagery that you're going to find of these Annunciations are going to be placed in porticos, like open porticos, which is just Italian word for porch. They're going to be placed in these open porticos that resemble balconies of monasteries, and like the open courtyard spaces that a lot of members of monasteries were used to. And then also, as I mentioned, the imagery that's included very much depends on if it's a public facing work or if it's a private facing work. So everything that I focus on in my paper is public facing. So that means that artists have a little bit more leeway with the colors they can use and how extravagant they can get with their imagery. And so when I talk about Filippo Lippi's work that is meant for, it's still public facing, but it's in a private home. I'm not sure, there's not much known about the location of the work. They just know that it was meant for the Palazzo Medici, which was the Medici's main palace in the center of Florence. And it would have been placed in one of the Medici's, I can't remember the word, like atrium, where their patrons and clients would come and go. And so the architecture that's included in that very much resembles the space that it would have been seen in. And so by putting Mary in an intimate bedroom space, they're emphasizing that location. And if we look back at the image, you can see that there is a bed in the background. There is a doorway that's leading up in the back to a set of stairs. And we kind of, the fourth wall has been pulled back and we're viewing into this space. And then for Leonardo da Vinci's work, it's set in a fully open portico, but still an enclosed garden space. And if you look on the right of the composition where Mary is leaned up against the wall, there's a door and it leads into another bedroom sanctuary space that would have been intimate. And then I didn't get to talk about Fra Angelico's Annunciation. He did like 4 or 5 different Annunciations throughout his career, and he had a very specific formula at that point because he had done it so many times. But I studied his work from 1426 for the observant Dominican monastery of San Domenico in Fiesole near Florence. And that is in a roofed portico. And in the back, there is a door again. And if you peek, like you get a little peek through that door and you see just a bench, a cabinet, and a window. And so that relates to the space that the imagery would have been seen in, which would have been a private prayer space for members of the monastery. So it really, it varies by location.
Thank you. Another question in the chat from Dr. Scalisi. Madison, can you reflect a bit on your approaches or method? I mean, these are artworks that are a bit famous. How did you go about learning something new about them, which is no small thing to do?
Well, it was definitely no small thing to do. I did the product of this paper was what I spent last semester doing with Dr. Holian. Spent an independent study, and this was my focus. So I spent 5 months developing this paper. And my first approach, because it was really whatever topic I wanted to do with anything that was in Dr. Holian's field of expertise. I've taken all the Renaissance classes with Dr. Holian, so I just flipped through all of my notes and picked out the few things that I was most drawn to and most interested in. And I really was interested in how many depictions of the Annunciation there was, and how when you look at them all together, they look very similar in just an artist's different style. But if you really dive deep into them, they all look incredibly different, and they all communicate the same message, but in the artist's own way. And so I am very, very grateful for Maggie, who helped me find a lot of sources. I struggled towards the beginning on finding sources that weren't in Italian. I can't speak Italian, I can't read Italian, so I was struggling really hard to find sources that I could actually read and that would be approachable to me. I also came across a situation where I had chosen certain Annunciation paintings, but there was just so little information on them that I could find that was in English or accessible through UNCG's databases, that I had to just scrap that idea and plug something else in that I could find more information on. And so it was a lot of digging through databases. It was a lot of asking Maggie and Dr. Holian for help and just pointing me in the right direction. It was also a lot of sitting on the floor of the library in the middle of the stacks and digging through books, trying to find information. And a lot of the new information that I learned that you're asking about, I found in really obscure articles that were super hard to find, or really old books from the library. A lot of my sources from my paper, I have like 3 pages of works cited. A lot of them were dissertations or theses for master's or graduate students that they wrote, and I had to double check with Dr. Holian asking if it was okay for me to use these. So it was hard, but there was a lot of new information to be found, and people's art historians' new ideas on these old paintings.
Thank you so much. Any additional questions for our panelists?
I have one for Sarah, and Sarah, I have to apologize because I got pulled out of my office for the middle part of your talking. So forgive me if you answered this already. I really apologize. But in thinking about, this particular program that you developed for the Kant Center, I wonder if you were thinking at all about, or have since thought about, like how an arts organization creates not just a program, but a program of programs, and how the way that programs intersect or overlap helps build that community buy-in, like helps make your place within the community? Because you did a lovely job of talking about like getting their feedback for that one program. Like, what are your thoughts on how we can be better about building rosters of programs?
That's a great question. I think so. Community engagement is a really, really big part of these arts organizations, and a really smart and not quick way, but a really good way of reaching out to these people is through community-based fundraising, which builds a kind of, like fan base of support, and also like bringing back artists for more programs that you knew that the community appreciated having at the organization for performances, just kind of going based off of their wants and needs, and being consistent in what you create and being consistent in your mission and values. Also, like donating to causes that align with your mission and supporting the community however you can, either through, money, which is probably not possible for a lot of organizations, or just even like labor. Just showing up where you're needed, and showing up when not a lot of people will show up, because that's always appreciated and it will be remembered. They will not forget that you were there. So I think just being there for the community, as well as being there as an organization, but more as, hey, we appreciate you. Also, like, we don't just want your money, because that's not the goal of this. The goal of all arts organizations is to build more community, which we saw in COVID. I mean, even in isolation, art brought people together. So I think that's probably not the easiest way, but I think that's the most direct way of doing that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we are actually coming right up against the end of our time slot. So I wanted to invite everybody to join me in congratulating our two panelists on their awesome projects and presentations today. And then also to remind everyone that the awards will be presented at 4:30, and here is a link, or I'm trying to get the link to copy into the Zoom chat if you would like to join us for that. So thank you again, Madison and Sarah, and we are so grateful for you sharing your work with us. Okay. Thanks, everyone.